"I never loved you," he said, and somehow that hurt less than the silence that followed. The room felt too large after that, like the walls had stepped back to watch me fall apart. Like even the air didn't want to be close to what we had just become, and I remember the exact sound my heartbeat made in my ears, slow and hollow, like something knocking from far away, asking to be let out. But I didn't move. I couldn't, because if I did, it would all become real, and Adrian Volkov never said things he didn't mean. That was the first rule everyone in this city knew. The man who ruled half of Manhattan without ever raising his voice. The man whose presence alone made rooms quieter, colder, sharper, and yet here I was, standing 3 feet away from him in a penthouse that looked out over miles of glittering skyline, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life, my fingers trembling just enough that I pressed them against my coat to hide it, because weakness was something he could smell, something he had taught me to bury. And still, I whispered, "You don't mean that," even though I already knew the answer before the words left my mouth. Because hope is stubborn like that. It lingers even when everything else is gone. And he didn't step closer, didn't soften, didn't even hesitate. He just looked at me with those calm, unreadable eyes and said nothing, which somehow hurt more than the words themselves. Because silence from a man like him wasn't confusion, it was confirmation. And that was the moment something inside me finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, irreversible shift, like a door closing in a house no one would ever enter again. And I nodded, once, because I refused to beg for something that was already gone, even if my chest felt tight, even if breathing suddenly took effort, even if there was 1,000 things I wanted to say, but none of them would matter now. And when I turned toward the door, I kept my steps steady, measured, like I had practiced leaving him 100 times in my head, even though this was the first time. It was real, the first time I wasn't coming back, and I wondered if he noticed, if he realized this wasn't just another argument, another night of distance and cold words, but something final, something that would echo long after I was gone. But he didn't stop me. Of course he didn't, because men like Adrian Volkov didn't chase, they didn't second guess, they made decisions and the world adjusted around them. And for a second, just one, my hand hovered over the door handle, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to say something, to tell him the truth. But I swallowed it down, every word, every fear, every fragile piece of hope, and my other hand moved instinctively, resting lightly against my stomach, a motion so small no one would have noticed, no one except me, because I could feel it now in a way I hadn't before, not physically, not yet, but emotionally. Like a quiet presence I carried alone, something that changed everything without making a sound. And that was the cruelest part of it all, that he stood there, composed and certain, completely unaware that the life we had created was already slipping out of his reach. And I let the silence answer him instead, because if he could say he never loved me without breaking, then he didn't deserve to know what I was carrying. And as I stepped out into the cold night air, the city lights blurring through the tears I refused to let fall, I realized something I hadn't before, something sharp and steady and strangely clear. He might have ruled this city, but he had just lost the only thing that would have made him human. I told myself I would not look back, but the glass doors reflected everything anyway. The city behind me, the rain beginning to fall in thin, quiet lines, and the outline of a man who did not move even after I left, standing exactly where I had abandoned him. Like nothing had changed, like everything had, and I stepped into the elevator with my breath held too tight in my chest, pressing the button for the lobby with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, because the version of me that had walked into his world no longer existed. She had been left upstairs with his words, with his silence, with everything I could not carry anymore. And as the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of that reflection, of him, still standing there. And I wondered if he felt anything at all, or if I had imagined every moment of warmth, every almost smile, every time his voice softened just enough to make me believe I mattered. But the doors shut before I could answer myself, and the descent began, slow and mechanical, each floor a quiet confirmation that I was leaving for real this time. And by the time I reached the lobby, my tears had dried into something colder, something sharper, something that would not break again so easily. The doorman glanced at me, but said nothing, trained not to ask questions, trained to ignore what did not concern him, and I walked past him into the night, into air that felt heavier than before, into a city that looked the same but felt completely different now that I was no longer part of his world. And I did not stop walking until the building disappeared behind me, until the lights blurred into something distant and untouchable, until my legs began to ache in a way that grounded me back into my body. And only then did I slow down, standing under the weak glow of a street lamp, my breath uneven, my thoughts louder than the traffic around me, and my hand moved again, instinctively, resting over my stomach as if I could protect something that had not even had the chance to exist yet. And for the first time, fear settled in, not for myself, but for what came next. Because leaving him was not just about heartbreak, it was about survival now, about choosing a life that did not revolve around a man who could erase me with a sentence. And I knew I could not stay in Manhattan, not with the way his world worked, not with the way people watched and reported and remembered faces. And by the time I reached my apartment, the decision had already been made. I packed only what I could carry in one suitcase: clothes, documents, a few things that still felt like mine, leaving behind anything that tied me to a life I could not return to. And when I found the small, white envelope tucked inside my drawer, my hands stilled for just a moment, the paper already worn at the edges from how many times I had unfolded it, stared at it, tried to understand it. And I did not open it this time. I did not need to. I already knew what it said. I already knew what it meant, and carefully, almost reverently, I placed it at the bottom of my bag, hidden beneath everything else, because some truths were not meant to be shared, not with someone who had already decided I meant nothing. And as dawn began to creep through the edges of the window, pale and uncertain, I took one last look at the apartment that had never really felt like home, and I walked out. Without turning off the lights, without leaving a note, without giving anyone the chance to follow, because disappearing was the only way to protect what I carried now, the only way to make sure that whatever future waited for me would not be shaped by his choices. And somewhere across the city, I knew Adrian Volkov was already moving on, already stepping into meetings, already making decisions that would ripple through lives he would never see, completely unaware that the one thing he could never replace had just walked away from him forever. 3 weeks later, I learned how quiet a life could be when no one was watching me anymore, when no black cars lingered across the street, when no one opened doors before I reached them, when my name did not carry weight in rooms I never asked to enter. And I told myself that was freedom, even when it felt more like absence, like something essential had been removed, and I had to relearn how to exist without it. The small town in upstate New York was nothing like Manhattan. No skyline, no constant noise, just long stretches of road and mornings that came slowly, gently, like they were not in a rush to prove anything. And I rented a small apartment above a bakery that smelled like sugar and coffee every morning at 6, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid on time and smiled when they greeted you. And I became someone else there, not completely, but enough to stay invisible. Emily Carter, who worked part-time at the front counter, who learned regular customers by name, who counted change carefully and kept her head down. And it should have felt like starting over, but starting over implies you leave everything behind. And I did not, because every quiet moment was filled with thoughts I could not outrun. Every night was heavier than the last as the reality of what I was carrying settled deeper into me, not just physically, but emotionally, a constant reminder that my life was no longer mine alone. And the first time I saw the doctor, I sat on the edge of the examination table with my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening to her voice explain things I already knew but needed to hear anyway. Weeks, measurements, timelines, everything reduced to numbers that somehow felt too small to hold the weight of it all. And when she turned the small screen toward me, I stopped breathing for a second, because there it was, not clear, not perfect, just a faint shape that should not have mattered to someone who had lost everything else. But it did, more than anything had ever mattered before, and I pressed my lips together to keep from crying. Because this was not sadness, this was something deeper. Something that made me feel both terrified and grounded at the same time, like I was standing on the edge of something irreversible. And for the first time since I left, I allowed myself to think about him, not the man who had spoken those words, but the one who had once looked at me like I was the only thing in the room that made sense. And I wondered if he would recognize this moment, if he would understand what it meant, or if he would dismiss it the same way he dismissed everything else. that did not fit into his controlled world, and I pushed that thought away as quickly as it came, because he was no longer part of this. He had made that clear, and I refused to let his absence define what came next. So I focused on small things instead, on routines, on the sound of the bakery downstairs opening every morning, on the way the sunlight moved across the floor in the afternoon, on the steady rhythm of a life that did not depend on anyone but me. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to change, not into someone stronger, not yet, but into someone who could endure, someone who could hold on to something fragile without breaking under the weight of it. And one evening, as I locked the shop and stepped outside into air that carried the first hint of autumn, cool and crisp against my skin, I realized something I had not expected. I was no longer waiting for him to come after me, no longer imagining footsteps behind me or a voice calling my name, because deep down, I knew he would not come, not because he could not find me, but because he believed I was not worth finding. And that realization did not shatter me the way it once would have. It settled, quietly, like acceptance, like the final piece of a truth I had been avoiding. And as I placed my hand over my stomach again, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, I made a promise I had not been ready to make before, that whatever happened next, whatever this life turned into, it would not be shaped by someone who chose to let me go. Back in Manhattan, nothing had changed, and that was exactly what felt wrong. The city still moved at the same relentless pace, black cars sliding through traffic like shadows, deals being made behind closed doors, names being whispered with the same careful respect, and Adrian Volkov stood at the center of it all like he always had, composed, precise, untouchable. But something had shifted in a way no one else could see, not in his schedule, not in his decisions, not in the way he carried himself through rooms filled with people who watched him like he was something more than human. But in the spaces between, in the pauses that had not existed before, in the seconds where his attention drifted somewhere he could not quite define, and it started small, barely noticeable, a missed call he did not return immediately, a meeting he cut short without explanation, a moment where someone repeated his name twice before he responded, and no one questioned it, because men like him were allowed to be unpredictable. But he noticed, and that was the problem, because Adrian Volkov did not overlook details, especially not when they belonged to him. And for the first time in years, something felt out of place in a way he could not control. The penthouse felt quieter now, not physically, but in a way that echoed when he walked through it at night. The absence of something he had never acknowledged until it was gone. And he found himself stopping in places without reason, near the window where she used to stand, near the kitchen counter where she would leave her coffee untouched when it went cold, small things that should not have mattered, but did, more than he was willing to admit even to himself. And one evening, as the city stretched out beneath him in a wash of distant lights, he realized he had not heard her voice in weeks, not in person, not through a message, not even as an echo in his mind the way memories sometimes lingered, and that silence was different from the one he had given her. This one felt like something had been taken, not dismissed, and he told himself it was temporary, that people left and were replaced, that attachments were weaknesses he had learned to avoid long before she ever entered his life. But the thought did not settle the way it should have. It stayed, persistent and quiet, like something waiting to be acknowledged. And when he finally asked about her, the question came out more direct than intended, her name spoken into a room that suddenly felt too still. And the answer was simple. Too simple. She had left, no forwarding address, no contact, nothing that could be traced easily. And that should have been the end of it. A closed file, a resolved absence. But instead, it created something new. A question that did not belong in his world. Why? And he did not like questions he could not answer. So he did what he always did. He began to look, not openly, not in a way that disrupted anything important, but quietly, methodically, pulling threads that might lead somewhere, even if he told himself it was only to confirm what he already believed, that she had chosen to leave, and that was all there was to it. But late at night, when the city finally slowed just enough for thoughts to surface, he found himself replaying that moment, the way she had looked at him, not angry, not desperate, just certain, and that certainty unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant she had known something he did not, something that made walking away easier than staying, and for the first time in a long time, Adrian Volkov felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his control. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of something that did not follow his rules, something that did not wait for his permission. And as he stood alone in a space that had never felt empty before, he realized that whatever he had dismissed that night had not disappeared. It had simply moved beyond his reach. And that was something he had never learned how to accept. The envelope should have meant nothing to him. Just another piece of paper among hundreds that crossed his desk every week. But it did not feel like nothing the moment his fingers brushed against it, because it did not belong there, tucked beneath a stack of routine documents in a drawer that was never used for anything important, and Adrian did not remember putting it there, which meant someone else had. Someone who either did not understand his rules or understood them too well, and for a brief second, he simply stared at it, white, unmarked, ordinary in a way that felt deliberate, like it was hiding something in plain sight, and he almost ignored it, almost pushed it aside in favor of more pressing matters, because that was what he always did with things that did not immediately serve a purpose. But something stopped him, something quiet and persistent that had been growing since the night she left, and without fully deciding to, he picked it up, turning it over once in his hand before opening it with the same controlled precision he applied to everything else in his life. And the moment his eyes landed on the contents, the room seemed to still in a way that had nothing to do with sound, because for the first time in years, Adrian Volkov did not process information immediately, did not categorize and respond with practiced efficiency. Instead, he read it once, then again, slower the second time, as if the meaning might change if he gave it enough space, but it did not. The words remained exactly the same. Clinical, straightforward, undeniable, dates, measurements, a timeline that aligned too perfectly with something he had chosen to dismiss, and his grip on the paper tightened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, because this was not a variable he had accounted for, not a possibility he had considered, and yet it was there, written in terms that left no room for interpretation. She had been pregnant, she had known, and she had walked away anyway, and that realization did not hit him all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, each thought connecting to the next in a way that built something he could not immediately control, because suddenly, that night was no longer just a decision. It was a fracture point, a moment that had altered more than he had allowed himself to see, and he found himself replaying it again, not as he remembered it, but as it must have been from her perspective, the words he had spoken, the silence that followed, the way she had left without arguing, without asking for anything, and for the first time, that did not look like acceptance. It looked like certainty, like she had already made a decision before he ever opened his mouth, and his jaw tightened as the implication settled in. She had not just left him, she had chosen to protect something from him, and that was something he did not understand, because everything in his world was built on control, on knowing, on eliminating risks before they had the chance to exist. But this had slipped through, unnoticed, unchallenged, and now it was gone, somewhere beyond his reach. And the thought should have triggered anger, should have pushed him into action immediately. But it did not. Not yet. Instead, it created something far more unfamiliar, a pause, a space where he could not move forward until he understood what had already been lost. And as he lowered the paper slowly onto the desk, his gaze fixed on it, as if it might offer something more if he stared long enough. One truth became impossible to ignore. This was not just about her leaving. It was about what she had taken with her, something that carried his name, his blood, something he had never planned for and now could not dismiss. And for the first time since that night, Adrian Volkov did not feel in control of the outcome, because whatever came next would not be dictated by power or strategy. It would depend on whether he could find something that had chosen to disappear from him completely. And that was a kind of uncertainty he had never faced before. He did not call anyone at first, which in itself was the first sign that something had shifted beyond recognition, because Adrian Volkov had built his entire life on immediate action, on decisions that moved faster than doubt. But now he stood alone in his office. The city stretched beneath him like a system he could still control, while the single piece of paper on his desk refused to fit into any system he understood. And he let the silence sit, heavy and unfamiliar, as if moving too quickly might erase something he had not fully grasped yet. and his mind began to reconstruct everything with a precision that bordered on obsession. The timeline, the days leading up to that night, the subtle changes he had dismissed, the moments where she had seemed distant but not afraid, quiet but not uncertain. And the more he traced it back, the clearer it became that she had known long before he ever spoke those words, that she had carried that truth alone while standing in front of him, while listening to him reduce everything they had to nothing. And for the first time, that realization did not sit as a fact. It pressed into him, slow and unrelenting, like something demanding acknowledgement. And he exhaled once, controlled, but not steady, because this was not a mistake he could correct with a transaction or a command. This was a moment that had already happened, a line that had been crossed without his awareness. And now the consequences existed somewhere beyond his reach. And that was what unsettled him the most. Not the idea of a child, not even the idea that she had left, but the fact that she had made that decision without him, had removed something that belonged to him from his world entirely. And yet, beneath that instinctive reaction, something else surfaced, something quieter and far more dangerous. The understanding that she had not done it out of spite, but out of certainty. Certainty that he would not choose her, would not choose them. And that thought lingered longer than it should have, because it forced him to confront something he had avoided for years, the difference between control and care, between possession and presence. And he pushed away from the desk abruptly, the movement sharper than intended, pacing once across the room before stopping near the window, his reflection staring back at him with the same composed expression that had never failed him before, except now it felt disconnected, like it belonged to someone who had not just realized what he had lost. And he ran a hand slowly across his jaw, grounding himself in something physical, something certain, because everything else felt unstable in a way he could not tolerate. And that was when the shift finally happened. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet decision forming beneath the surface, replacing hesitation with something far more deliberate. Because if she had chosen to disappear, then he would find her, not out of anger, not to reclaim control, but because there was no longer a version of this situation where he could remain still. And he turned back toward the desk, toward the paper that had rewritten everything without warning. And this time, when he reached for his phone, there was no pause, no uncertainty, just a clear, focused intent that felt different from anything he had acted on before. Because this was not about power, it was not about proving anything. It was about something he had never had to pursue on equal ground, something that could not be forced or commanded. And as he gave the first instruction, his voice steady but lower than usual, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever came next would not be decided by who he was in this city. It would be decided by whether she was willing to let him back into a life she had already begun without him. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Volkov did not know the outcome, only that standing still was no longer an option. I stopped checking the door after the first month, not because I felt safe, but because I finally understood that safety did not come from waiting for something to happen. It came from accepting that nothing would, and life settled into something steady, something quiet enough that I could almost pretend the past belonged to someone else. The bakery became my anchor, the rhythm of mornings and customers and simple conversations grounding me in ways I had never needed before, and my world narrowed to manageable pieces: work, home, doctor visits, small routines that gave structure to days that might have otherwise felt overwhelming. And with each passing week, the reality of what I carried became more tangible. Not just an idea, not just a decision, but something real. Something that shifted my balance slightly when I walked. Something that made me pause in the middle of tasks just to breathe and adjust. And I learned to listen to my body in a way I never had before, to slow down when needed, to rest without guilt, to exist without constantly anticipating the next disruption. And for a while, it worked. For a while, I believed I had created enough distance between my past and my present that they could no longer touch each other. But distance has a way of feeling thinner when you least expect it. And the first crack came in the form of a question I had not prepared for. Simple, casual, asked by a regular customer who had grown comfortable enough to notice the details I tried to keep hidden. "Are you expecting?" she asked with a soft smile. And I froze for just a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way that could not be undone. And I nodded slowly, forcing a small smile in return. She congratulated me like it was something joyful, something uncomplicated, and I thanked her, because that was the expected response, because explaining the truth would have required more than I was willing to give. And after she left, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting against the counter as if I needed something solid to hold on to. And that was when I realized something had shifted again, not in my life, but in how I saw it, because until that moment, this had been something private, something contained within the boundaries I had built, but now it was visible, undeniable, something the world could see even if it did not understand. And that visibility came with a different kind of weight, one I had not anticipated. And that night, as I walked home under a sky that had begun to turn colder, the air sharper against my skin, I felt it again, that subtle awareness that I was no longer completely alone, not in the way I had been before, and it should have been comforting. It should have made everything easier, but instead, it brought a new kind of uncertainty. Because this life I was building was no longer just about survival. It was about what came next, about what kind of future I could offer without the things I had left behind. And as I reached my apartment and paused at the door, my hand resting lightly against my stomach in a gesture that had become second nature, I made a quiet promise I did not fully know how to keep yet, that whatever happened, I would not let the past come back and claim what I had fought to protect, because some choices, once made, could not be undone. And I had already chosen this path, even if I did not yet know where it would lead. I felt him before I saw him, not in a dramatic way, not like something out of a story, but in the smallest shift of the air, in the way my body stilled for no reason I could explain, in the quiet instinct that something familiar had entered a place I had carefully built to be untouched. And I told myself it was nothing, just another passing moment. Just my mind playing tricks on me the way it sometimes did when I let it wander too far into memories I had promised myself to leave behind. But when I looked up from the register and saw him standing just inside the doorway of the bakery, everything inside me went silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound, because Adrian Volkov did not belong here, not in a place that smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon, not under soft lights that made everything feel smaller, safer, more human. And yet he stood there as if he had always known exactly where to find me. His presence unchanged, controlled, precise, the same man who had once filled entire rooms without effort. But something about him felt different, not weaker, not uncertain, just focused in a way I had never seen before, like the world outside these walls no longer mattered. And for a second, neither of us moved, the space between us holding more than words ever could. And I became acutely aware of everything at once, the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind me, the distant sound of someone laughing outside, the steady rhythm of my own breathing that suddenly felt too loud, too uneven, and instinctively, my hand shifted, resting protectively over my stomach in a gesture I could not stop, even if I tried. And his eyes followed the movement, not immediately, not obviously, but enough that I saw the exact moment something in his expression changed. Subtle, controlled, but undeniable, like a piece of a puzzle finally locking into place. And I felt my chest tighten, because I knew what that meant, knew that whatever distance I had created had just collapsed into something fragile and exposed. And still, I forced myself to stay where I was, to not step back, to not run, because running had been a choice I made once, and I had accepted the consequences of it. And now there was no version of this where I could pretend he was not here, that he had not found me. And when he finally spoke, my name sounded different than I remembered, lower, quieter, like he had learned something in the silence between us. Emily. And I hated how easily it pulled at something I thought I had buried, how it made the past feel closer than it should have been. And I straightened slightly, grounding myself in the present, in the reality I had built without him. You should not be here, I said, my voice steady even if everything inside me was not. And he did not argue, did not dismiss it the way he once would have. Instead, he took a single step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to show that he was not leaving, not this time. And for a moment, we stood there like that, two versions of people who had once known each other completely and now felt like strangers, standing on opposite sides of something neither of us could undo. And then his gaze dropped again, briefly, to where my hand still rested, and when it lifted back to mine, there was no confusion left in it, only certainty. and something else I had never seen before, something that made my breath catch despite everything I had told myself. "How far along are you?" he asked, and the question was simple, direct, but it carried everything that had been left unsaid between us, everything he had not known, everything I had chosen to protect. And for the first time since he walked into that door, I felt the ground beneath me shift in a way I could not control, because this was no longer about the past, it was about what came next, and I realized, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the life I had built in his absence was about to collide with the one I had tried to escape, and neither of us would walk away from it unchanged. For a moment, I could not answer him, not because I did not know the number, but because saying it out loud would mean acknowledging that this was no longer just mine to carry, that the line I had drawn so carefully had already been crossed the second he walked through that door, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, grounding myself in the present instead of the past that threatened to pull me under. 6 months, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough to hold, and I watched the way the information settled over him, not with shock, not with disbelief, but with a kind of stillness that felt heavier than any reaction I had prepared for, like he was recalculating something far deeper than time, far deeper than distance, and his gaze did not leave mine, not even for a second, as if looking away might undo the reality he had just stepped into. And for the first time since I had known him, Adrian Volkov looked like a man standing in front of something he could not control, and that should have given me some sense of power, some sense of balance in a situation that had always been tilted in his favor, but it did not, because this was not about winning. This was about everything that had already been lost before either of us understood the cost, and I straightened slightly, pulling my hand away from where it rested, not to hide, but to remind myself that I was not the same person who had stood in front of him months ago waiting for something he would never give. "You do not get to ask questions now," I said, and the words came easier than I expected, sharper, clearer, shaped by everything I had endured in his absence, and he did not interrupt, did not dismiss it, just listened in a way that felt unfamiliar, like he understood that this was not a conversation he could control. And I took a step back, creating space where there had once been none. "You made your decision," I continued, each word measured, deliberate, and I made mine. And there was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just truth, because anger would have tied me to him in a way I could not afford anymore. And for a second, I thought he might argue, might remind me of everything he could offer, everything he could fix, but he did not. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, but enough to break the tension that had been holding the room still. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I could not ignore, not softer, not weaker, just honest, stripped of the certainty that had once defined him. "I was wrong," he said, and the words landed differently than anything else he had ever said to me, because they did not come with conditions, did not come with expectations, just a simple acknowledgement that shifted something between us in a way I had not anticipated. And I felt my chest tighten despite everything, because part of me had waited for those words, even when I told myself I had not. But waiting and accepting were two very different things, and I held his gaze, steady, unyielding. "That does not change anything," I replied, because it did not. Not the nights I had spent alone, not the decisions I had made to protect something he had not even known existed, not the life I had built piece by piece without him. And he nodded once, as if he had expected that answer, as if he had already accepted it before I spoke, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the distance between us filled with everything we could not undo, everything we would have to live with moving forward. And then, quietly, without stepping closer, without reaching for something he no longer had the right to claim, he said something that changed the direction of everything that would come next. "I am not here to take anything from you," he said, his voice steady in a way that felt different from before. "I am here to earn the chance to be part of it." And I felt the weight of those words settle over me, not as a promise, not as a guarantee, but as something uncertain and fragile, something that would not be decided in a single moment or a single conversation. And for the first time since he had walked into my life, I realized that whatever happened next would not be determined by his power or my fear, but by something far more difficult, something that neither of us had ever truly understood before, whether he could become the kind of man who deserved to stay, and whether I could allow myself to believe it.